As I now invite Ranjana Adhikari, partner IndusLaw, to spearhead this quick chat for us. And can we also have a round of applause? Let's also welcome on stage Ranjana Adhikari. Over to you.
That was very well done, Ben. I was so immersed in, especially the part that you spoke about, good practices exist, but importing the right ones for you, that the thought is so important to hold on to, what works for you best. And I do hope that over the course of today's fireside chat, we do explore a few of those nuances, more contextualized to how we could do things better in India. Ben's come all the way from UK, so thank you for that. I'm really grateful for IMI to sort of make this happen, because I think it is the right time and place today for India to have a conversation with market leaders, regulators such as Ben, and enhance these very collaborative discussions of learning from each other. I like the thought that what we learn, there's a lot for the Indian government to also sort of give back in terms of the learnings. The sheer population of a country has, given us data sets that perhaps may help a lot of progressive regulation in a lot of other countries as well. So I do hope, Ben, over a period of time, starting here from, those dialogues are only going to increase between IGRA and the Indian regulators. So we will keep that ball rolling over there as well. You've already set the context in terms of, what we'd be discussing, but for the benefit of everyone here, I think it would be best to use Ben's time today to understand on a topic which is very close to a lot of us. You mentioned about consumers and consumer centricity. I think one of the key themes for Indian regulators and the industry has really been everything centric to the consumer. Transparency is the second theme, and the third of the very important theme, I would believe, is being responsible. And responsible as a platform to create a safe and trusted ecosystem for the players on it. So the third theme is what I would like to sort of, explore a bit more in this conversation with you, and talk a little more about just responsible gaming practices as such. You and I have been having a lot of discussions on where India is, and everyone here are very aware of the fact that we're more self-regulated as opposed to a proper framework in place. We do have something in the form of the IT rules amendments still to come into effect, but we are all looking at it, crystal ball gazing, and hoping that, it goes full-fledged ahead. But what's interesting to sort of, when we look at other communities and different countries, we do understand that most of them thrive under more prescriptive regulations. But we've seen a shift, especially in terms of advertising, for example, even UK sort of exploring a bit more in terms of being a very collaborative approach with the industry in terms of nuancing these things. In your view, we are self-led today. Organizations sort of sign up with the self-regulatory bodies. So it's not harmonized. It's not something that every operator out there today is adhering to. So we're trying to do a good job, but there still are those set of players, who are not on the same page. From your experience, could you probably throw some light in terms of just the importance of maybe having a central law, harmonizing this, and how do you think this would really benefit where responsible gaming is concerned?
So I think there are two aspects here. There's one in terms of what's best for consumers, and the other perhaps is what is best for industry. And the hope clearly is that the two sometimes will sort of collide in a sweet spot. I think if you are at a headline level, if an industry can demonstrate the outcomes that at a headline level a government is trying to achieve, then that would put it in a good position in terms of a reasonably light touch regulatory regime. I guess that's the ideal, because no one wants any more bureaucracy than is needed. But I guess if you're a consumer, then a couple of the things that you might be thinking about is getting a consistent experience in terms of the products that you engage with and the different companies that you engage with too. So the outcome doesn't always have to be delivered perhaps in the same way, but at the very least you can have some feeling or understanding that, okay, yeah, this is a different operator, but I recognize some of this from when I was dealing with another one somewhere else. I think there's also a perspective that there is a sort of a headline level of care. When we've done quite a lot of consumer research in the UK to try and sort of understand what consumers are after. And the type of conversation you always get is that, well, I don't need protection, but I know someone who does. And that is generally the way the conversation goes. So how do you, as a society, demonstrate that you have a sort of consistent level of care towards those people who are engaging with your products? But I think there's also a question from an industry point of view as well, in terms of ensuring that everyone is playing on a level playing field, as we would say in the UK. So everyone wants to have the same sort of cost base that their competitor has. And I think this is where it's quite interesting in India, where you have that sort of burgeoning industry. Because if you are an established player and you're not that interested in seeing competition, you might argue that actually a nice, high-level, consistent set of standards is good for you because it will discourage others. Whereas if you're a challenger and you want to be able to get moving quickly, this will potentially sort of get in the way. So I think from an industry point of view, there is a sweet spot where everyone is encouraged to a level, but it doesn't discourage competition. And the trick then is blending that with what is right for the consumer, and then hopefully you sort of alight on the right approach. Because what you need to consider really is the level of risk of what you're doing. And if you can understand the level of risk and therefore what you might be trying to achieve, I think that helps just set things out very clearly for everyone.
I think from what you say, I think the one thing that would really help would be to build user trust, right? Stemming from your conversation earlier, you're right. I think the conversation around just responsible gaming measures is not enough till you don't, assess the impact of what you're trying to achieve, right? That's what you said. You always decide what your end goal is. Your end goal, one of the things in my mind is also achieving user trust for your platforms. So I'd like to share an anecdote over here when we're talking about self-regulation. About 5 or 6 years back, when I was invited by IGRA for one of their annual events, and it was very interesting that I was in a room full of about 150 regulators asked to talk about the success story of self-regulation in India. And it's a hard one to do because you're in a room full of regulators telling them, look, what you're doing is not really, sufficient. Talk to the industry more. Here's India. They know what they're doing, even minus regulation. We're probably an aberration to the rule book. I really haven't heard of another country who's adopted self-regulation as fervently for an industry as large as us. But always room to sort of, learn from there. And that's why we are having this conversation as well.
And if I can just add to that, I think sometimes there is a place for both. So you can have a situation where there are certain regulations in certain areas, but in others, industry codes that are sort of put together voluntarily, as you say, can also work. And we see that in the UK, right? So we have a regulatory structure, but there's also space, and we encourage that space for industry to say, we can see something here around advertising or engagement with consumers. And actually, we can put together, hopefully, something that you will think is okay, and we will get on with that. So in the UK, I think we're keen to have a sort of a balance.
That neatly segues to a question that's been on my mind about advertising. I think there's been a lot of impetus in rule-making in India, especially in the last 12 to 18 months, on, just advertising by illegal and sort of bad actor platforms in general. A lot of it because, we don't have a central law as such. A lot of that is being done under more of the advertising laws and under the aegis of what we call as Ministry of Information Broadcasting. And hopefully it will be consolidated at a certain juncture. You just mentioned about just approach to advertising that UK has. Would love to hear some of the key challenges that you're facing, and especially in the recent times with advertising, and any measures that you've sort of, taken to sort of overcome that we could learn from, especially in the Indian context.
So I think as an industry, you need to think, first of all, really carefully, once again, about what you are trying to achieve and whether anything that you are doing will impact that. And sometimes, to your point around building trust, which I think is really important and something one of my teams back in the UK has spent quite a bit of time researching, because we want to track the level of trust that the nation has with the sector. So I think that is really important. And as an industry, one of the learnings that I think you see from around the world, that is if you flood the market with advertising as an industry, that impacts everyone. And so understanding when you could and when you should advertise from times of day to around particular events is a really important conversation to have. Because if you look at some jurisdictions, say Italy, where advertising is banned, Spain, where there are some regulations around timings and volume, Ontario in Canada, where they're quite clear about what you can and can't do with regard to encouraging players, you will see that a government often reacts to sort of public clamour. And I think with advertising, you need to have a good understanding to start with in terms of what you're trying to do, but also read the public, the national room, if you like, because that may well lead you to a sort of more severe consequence, as I was alluding to earlier.
So I would probably add a little bit of a caveat here, going back to your earlier conversation of these are great practices that are being adopted, but needs to be seen in the context of India, where it's really the skill gaming, casual gaming, social gaming market which is thriving. I think a lot of the examples may be not necessarily for just these products, but maybe beyond that as well, as gambling is regulated in other countries. So yes, I think a lot of learnings that we could take from advertising and some of these things in terms of just sort of being responsible about your approach, right? And could be self-led as well. Another topic that I feel which is very close to everyone here, especially the conversation that we had yesterday with the Tamil Nadu regulator too. The mind shift is sort of shifting for the regulators to consider whether there need to be certain self-imposed sort of, I won't say self-imposed, but government-imposed deposit limits, time limits. I feel very strongly about this topic, because at the end of the day, for us, the gaming industry is really for people who are 18 years and above, people who can make a decision for themselves, right? While the same sort of conversation is relevant even to those gaming products which are not real money gaming and targeted content products that are retargeted to minors as well. But just focusing, on this whole theme of time and deposit limits, is it something that you've seen in other jurisdictions which has worked effectively? Is it something we should go down? I feel very strongly about user autonomy and sort of enabling them to make the decisions and sort of socializing what's available on the platform. But from your experience, if you could share, how have countries been successful or failed in this department?
So I think that specific example is one that is still sort of subject to research. So I've seen research in the UK where some forms of limits, whether that's around time or deposit, have led to a decrease in the amount of play or a sort of a softening of someone's play compared to their behavior from before. But I think I would sort of lift it up one level. And I think when you look at your sort of industry, there are perhaps sort of 4 things that you need to do. And the first one is to consider the overall environment. So it's not in some ways just about a sort of setting a limit or on a deposit or a time. It's looking at the entire consumer journey that happens with an engagement with the industry and understanding where you think the points of risk are, and then putting in the tools to enable people, as you say, potentially to take advantage of that. Because not everyone is the same. It's a truism, but I think it's worth repeating, right? That you need to consider that environment wherein not everyone is the same. So some people might need more help than others. And so you've got a bit of an interesting challenge of how you introduce those sorts of tools with the minimum amount of friction. And I think, the things that annoy people that are put in people's way that make their experience more difficult. So we were talking a little bit before just about when I get in my car at home now, unless I've got the seatbelt on, it won't even move, and it annoys me intensely, right? Because you're introducing friction. Whereas when I'm on the motorway and I might sort of veer slightly, a message will pop up and say, do you want a coffee? Now that I actually respond to better, and that's me. But if my mother was getting in the car, I would want that car to be talking to her, putting on that seatbelt straight away. So we're different, and therefore we need a sort of different level of protection. And I think you're starting to see that more and more across Europe in particular, where people are trying things like limits, and they're trying things around sort of checks, and they're trying to understand that consumer journey much more. So it might not be the context, the environment, it might be the product. Some products are more risky than others. We need to understand that. Some aspects of products within the actual product themselves are more risky. We need to understand that. But I think the important thing comes in terms of understanding what the consumer behavior is, so that when you put in some of these checks, you can go, right, we've put this in, what has been the impact? Has it done what we thought it would do? So in the UK, for example, we've changed the regulations around some games to make them play slightly slower, so that people can't play them quite so quickly. And it's interesting for us then to say, okay, now you can start to see how some of these little nudges have an impact. But as I say, it is important to try and make that as frictionless as you can.
I think this point on friction is super important as well, because the experience suggests, and one would anticipate, that the more friction that you sort of put in the journey of a player, they can segue to illegal platforms. And what you're trying to achieve would be sort of counterintuitive, because you're trying to protect the consumer at the end of the day. But you've sort of got into the shoes of being, well, the parent or the class monitor, and you sort of pushed them away to the bad actors. So I think a lot of food for thought over there. I think South Korea is an example as well, where time limits have not been as successful, and they've been experimenting with that. And it's an example where a lot of the users have sort of moved to the illegal platforms as well. I'm conscious that we have lesser time left, and I'll probably look at IMI folks to say if we have a couple of more minutes, because I do have an interesting question for him. Okay, all right. So Ben, I think making use of what we have left with us, it would be great to sort of hear from all the discussions you've heard so far. And in terms of, just we've not had any conversation around, say, minors, for example. Any top 2 or 3 sort of responsible gaming practices that you feel would be not just good practices, but relevant practices for India to adopt?
So certainly around education, I think that is something in particular in the UK that we are spending more and more time on, because clearly sort of prevention is better than cure. So I think from our point of view, particularly with minors, the more that can be done in schools, for example, in terms of them understanding what they are doing, so that you're having a similar conversation perhaps to the one that they might have around alcohol or around narcotics, that they understand risk. It's not to frighten children, clearly, but it's around trying to make them understand the world that they live in now, which is clearly quite different to ours. So I do think education is important. I think there are things you can do around controls, around registration, that can also help, and we certainly in the UK had a lot of success with that. And clearly people will find a way. So I agree, you have to sort of judge that right. But it's about putting in a framework that will protect the many, and having the evidence base that helps you understand the few and see what more you need to do in the future.
We could maybe just move on to any last closing remarks that you have, Ben.
I think, well, just from my own point of view, it's been amazing to be here and have such a warm welcome from such a lovely country, and I really appreciate that. From my own perspective, around the sort of topics we've been talking about, it's been great to hear the sort of conversations where clearly you are starting to engage around an evidence base, so that discussions are held around fact and not around sort of personal views. I think that's really interesting. I think it's been invigorating to hear people talk about how gamification can be used in education, and how it can be a sort of force for good from that point of view. And then finally, I think it was really interesting to hear how passionate people are around filling the skills gap in this space, because I would agree with that it's one of the harder things to do, I think, is to fill the gaps in this sector. And the more people that look at it as a career, and the more diverse set of people that you have looking at this as a career, I think the more rounded a sector will become.
Thank you so much, Ben, for having taken out your time and just spending a very warm afternoon with us. We clearly are the ones between lunch and the folks here. It would be great to have a round of applause for Ben Haden, President of IGRA. Thank you, everyone.